September 1st, 1939, 04:45. Warsaw, Poland. Journalist Stefan Starczynski sat in the offices of Polish radio, headphones pressed against his ears as he listened to the German broadcast that had begun precisely at dawn. The voice was calm, measured, almost soothing. Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels himself, speaking not with the hysteria Polish intelligence had expected, but with the quiet confidence of a man announcing an inevitable truth. Since 5:45 this morning, we have been returning fire. From now on, bombs will be met with bombs. Starczynski had spent 3 years monitoring German radio broadcasts, documenting the systematic escalation of propaganda that preceded this moment. He had warned his superiors that the Germans were waging a war without soldiers, conquering territory without crossing borders, defeating enemies before the first shot was fired. They had dismissed him as alarmist. Now, as German bombers appeared over Warsaw, and the voice continued its calm recitation of manufactured grievances, Starczynski understood what his government had failed to grasp. The invasion had not begun at 04:45 with artillery fire. It had begun 3 years earlier with the first broadcast from the Deutschlandsender transmitter, the most powerful radio station on Earth, capable of reaching every corner of Europe with crystal clarity. The shells falling on Warsaw were merely the physical manifestation of a conquest that had already occurred in the minds of millions who had listened, believed, and accepted the narrative that made this moment seem justified, even necessary. Over 70 million radio receivers existed in European homes by September 1939. 28 million of those were in Germany, manufactured specifically to receive Nazi broadcasts and incapable of tuning to foreign stations. But the German transmitters reached far beyond Germany's borders into the homes of Austrians, Czechs, Poles, French, British, and neutral populations who would discover too late that the voice in their living room had been reshaping reality itself, one broadcast at a time, preparing the psychological terrain for tanks that would follow. The transformation had begun not with Hitler's rise to power, but 6 years earlier, in July 1933, when Joseph Goebbels, newly appointed Reichsminister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, made a decision that would redefine the nature of modern warfare. He was sitting in his Berlin office, reviewing reports on German radio ownership, when he recognized what every other propaganda minister in Europe had missed. Radio was not simply a tool for spreading messages, it was a weapon for replacing reality. March 1933, Berlin. Reich Chancellery. The men gathered around the conference table represented Germany's broadcasting establishment. Directors of regional radio stations, technical experts, programming chiefs, all expecting Goebbels to outline a conventional propaganda strategy using existing radio infrastructure. What they heard, instead, shocked them into silence. "Gentlemen, you think of radio as a medium for entertainment and occasional political speeches," Goebbels began, his voice carrying the intensity that would become his trademark. "This is primitive thinking. Radio is the most powerful weapon ever created for the conquest of human consciousness. We will not use it to broadcast messages. We will use it to create a new reality that exists only in the minds of those who listen. When we finish, the German people will hear only our truth. They will think only our thoughts. They will believe only what we tell them to believe. And they will do so willingly, gratefully, because we will make them feel that our reality is superior to the reality they can see with their own eyes." Dr. Hans Fritzsche, who had become head of the radio division in the propaganda ministry, was present at that meeting. His testimony at Nuremberg in 1946 described what followed. Goebbels outlined a plan that seemed insane. He wanted every German household to own a radio within 2 years. He wanted regional programming eliminated and replaced with centralized broadcasts controlled entirely from Berlin. He wanted to jam foreign stations. He wanted to make listening to foreign broadcasts a criminal offense. He wanted to install loudspeakers in every factory, every restaurant, every public space in Germany. Most radically, he wanted to create a radio so cheap that even the poorest German could afford it, specifically designed to receive only German stations. We thought him mad. Within 3 years, he had accomplished everything he proposed. The Volksempfänger V301, named for January 30th, 1933, the date Hitler became Chancellor, entered production in August 1933, priced at 76 Reichsmarks when comparable radios cost over 200 Reichsmarks. It was simple, functional, and deliberately limited. The receiver could tune to German stations with perfect clarity, but lacked the sensitivity to pick up foreign broadcasts reliably. Over 1.5 million units sold in the first year. But the cheap radio was merely the delivery mechanism. The revolution occurred in what Germans heard when they turned it on, the architecture of manufactured reality radio. Broadcasting before Goebbels followed predictable patterns, news at fixed times, entertainment programs, educational content, political speeches as special events. The model assumed listeners tuned in for specific programs, then resumed normal life. Goebbels understood this approach was fatally limited. If radio competed with reality, reality would win. The solution was to make radio become reality. The German Broadcasting Corporation, reorganized under Propaganda Ministry control in July 1933, implemented a programming strategy unprecedented in broadcasting history. From 06 Gauck to 24 Swan, German radio provided continuous content designed not to entertain or inform, but to psychologically immerse listeners in an alternative reality where Nazi ideology seemed natural, obvious, and inevitable. Eugen Hadamowski, appointed Reichsintendant of German radio in 1933, explained the philosophy in his 1934 book Propaganda and National Power. We do not broadcast programs, we create environment. The listener must never experience silence that allows independent thought. Music, news, drama, comedy, speeches, all flow seamlessly to create a world that exists only in the ether, but feels more real than the world outside the window. The listener, who spends hours daily in this world, gradually forgets which world is real. That is when we have won. The morning began with martial music and uplifting announcements. Workers arriving at factories heard the same broadcasts through loudspeakers installed by government mandate. Lunch hours featured dramatic serializations emphasizing sacrifice for the Volk. Afternoons brought educational programs explaining racial science, geopolitics, and historical grievances that justified Germany's destiny. Evenings offered entertainment carefully crafted to reinforce Nazi themes without obvious propaganda. Late-night broadcasts targeted insomniacs and shift workers with hypnotic music and repetitive messaging. British intelligence officer Richard Crossman, who monitored German broadcasts from 1936-1939, reported to MI6 in May 1939. The Germans have discovered something we missed. Propaganda is most effective when the audience doesn't recognize it as propaganda. Their entertainment programs contain Nazi ideology so naturally integrated that listeners absorb the message while believing they're simply being entertained. A comedy sketch mocks Jewish stereotypes without mentioning Jews explicitly. A historical drama presents German expansion as defensive necessity. A music program intersperses Wagner with speeches by Hitler, creating unconscious association between aesthetic beauty and political ideology. The cumulative effect is devastating. Germans who listen regularly don't think they're being propagandized. They think they're staying informed and entertained. The propaganda works precisely because it's invisible. The technical infrastructure supporting this psychological operation exceeded anything previously attempted. By 1936, Germany operated 22 high-powered transmitters, including the Deutschlandsender, a 100-kilowatt behemoth broadcasting on long-wave frequency that reached from London to Moscow with minimal interference. Regional transmitters ensured every corner of Germany received broadcasts at full strength. The system cost over 150 million Reichsmarks, more than the Kriegsmarine spent on capital ships in 1935. The investment proved strategically brilliant. While other nations built bombers and battleships, Goebbels built a weapon that conquered territory without firing a shot. Austria. Conquest by consent. The annexation of Austria in March 1938 demonstrated radio's power to make military invasion feel like liberation. For 3 years prior, Austrian citizens had tuned to German broadcasts that painted a picture of a greater Germany where Austrians and Germans shared blood, culture, and destiny, being artificially separated by the Treaty of Versailles. The broadcasts were sophisticated. No crude nationalism. Instead, Austrian-born announcers spoke lovingly of a unified German-speaking world, of economic prosperity through integration, of cultural renaissance when artificial borders dissolved. German radio featured Austrian musicians, Austrian poets, Austrian intellectuals, all explaining why separation was tragedy and unification was destiny. Dr. Kurt Schuschnigg, Austrian Chancellor from 1934-1938, tried to counter German broadcasts with Austrian programming, emphasizing independence. His efforts failed completely. Interviewed in 1946, he explained why. We broadcast facts, population statistics showing Austrian economic independence, historical evidence of distinct Austrian identity, logical arguments for sovereignty. Goebbels broadcast emotion. German radio didn't argue Austria should join Germany. It made Austrians feel they already were German, that current borders were temporary aberrations, that unification was returning home. You cannot defeat emotion with facts. When German troops crossed the border in March 1938, many Austrians welcomed them not as invaders, but as liberators, reuniting a family artificially divided. Goebbels had conquered Austria 3 years before Hitler's tanks arrived. The Austrian annexation provided Goebbels with tangible proof that psychological conquest preceded military conquest. The model would be refined and applied to Czechoslovakia, Poland, and eventually the entirety of Europe. Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland crisis. The dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in 1938-1939 showcased radio propaganda's ability to manufacture international crises that seemed to justify German aggression. Beginning in January 1938, German broadcasts focused obsessively on the Sudeten Germans, ethnic Germans living in Czechoslovakia's border regions. The broadcasts followed a calculated escalation. Initial programs featured sympathetic stories of discrimination against German minorities. Cultural programs emphasized Sudeten German contributions to European civilization being suppressed by Czech authorities. News broadcasts reported incidents of anti-German violence, many fabricated or wildly exaggerated. Political commentary framed the situation as intolerable persecution requiring international intervention. William Shirer, American journalist stationed in Berlin, monitored these broadcasts and recorded his observations in his diary, later published as Berlin Diary. His September 12, 1938 entry captured the strategy. For 8 months, German radio has created an entirely fictional crisis in Czechoslovakia. They report atrocities that never happened. They interview victims who don't exist. They describe a reign of terror that isn't occurring. Yet the repetition has created reality. Germans believe Sudeten Germans are being massacred. More insidiously, international audiences have absorbed the narrative that there is a Sudeten problem requiring solution. Hitler hasn't created a crisis. Goebbels created a crisis, and Hitler will now solve the crisis that exists only because millions of Europeans heard it on the radio and accepted it as real. The Munich Conference in September 1938, where Britain and France agreed to German annexation of the Sudetenland, represented a victory for radio as much as for diplomacy. European leaders negotiated away Czech territory to solve a problem that German propaganda had created. When British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London claiming peace in our time, he was responding to a reality manufactured by Goebbels, not to actual conditions in Czechoslovakia. The broadcasts targeting Czechoslovakia revealed another innovation. Goebbels understood that effective propaganda must offer plausible deniability. German radio never explicitly called for Czechoslovakia's destruction. It simply reported suffering, expressed sympathy, and suggested that civilized nations couldn't tolerate persecution of minorities. The audience drew the conclusion that German intervention was humanitarian necessity. The propaganda worked because listeners believed they reached their own conclusions rather than accepting Nazi directives. Poland. Justifying the unjustifiable. The campaign against Poland in 1939 perfected techniques developed in Austria and Czechoslovakia. Beginning in March 1939, German broadcasts constructed a narrative of Polish aggression, German suffering, and inevitable confrontation that made the September invasion seem like defensive response rather than unprovoked attack. The Gleiwitz incident on August 31, 1939, demonstrated how radio and staged violence could create justification for war. SS operatives dressed in Polish uniforms attacked a German radio station near the Polish border, broadcast anti-German propaganda in Polish, then left corpses in Polish uniforms as evidence. German radio reported the incident as Polish aggression within hours, repeating the story continuously as proof that Poland had fired the first shot. The deception succeeded completely. Germans who heard the broadcasts believed Poland had attacked first. International audiences, saturated with 8 months of reports about German suffering under Polish persecution, found the incident plausible. When German forces crossed the Polish border the next morning, they were responding to aggression, not initiating it, at least according to the reality German radio had created. Stefan Stasinski, the Polish journalist who monitored German broadcasts, managed to escape Warsaw and reached London in October 1939. His report to Polish intelligence, preserved in British archives, contained both admiration and horror. Goebbels has militarized propaganda. His broadcasts don't persuade, they conquer. By the time German troops entered Poland, the psychological terrain had been prepared so thoroughly that invasion seemed inevitable, even justified. Polish voices trying to counter German narratives were dismissed as defensive lies from guilty parties. We lost the propaganda war completely. The shooting war was merely confirmation of a defeat already accomplished through radio broadcasts that created a reality where Germany was victim and Poland was aggressor. The truth was irrelevant. Millions across Europe believed the narrative they heard on German radio, and belief creates political reality more effectively than facts. The weapon turns. Inward, controlling German minds. Radio's power to conquer foreign populations was matched by its effectiveness in controlling German domestic opinion. Goebbels understood that waging total war required total control of German consciousness. Every doubt, every question, every flicker of resistance had to be preemptively addressed and neutralized. The radio crime decree of September 1, 1939, made listening to foreign broadcasts punishable by imprisonment or death. Over 1,500 Germans would be executed during the war for this offense. But legal prohibition was crude enforcement. The sophisticated approach made foreign broadcasts seem irrelevant. German radio provided such comprehensive coverage of events, always framed to support Nazi narratives, that listeners felt no need to seek alternative sources. When military setbacks occurred, German broadcasts acknowledged them first, framing defeats as temporary obstacles or strategic withdrawals. When Allied bombings killed civilians, German radio broadcast immediate coverage, emphasizing German resilience and Allied barbarity. The strategy denied foreign broadcasts their primary advantage, the revelation of information Germans lacked. Ruth Andreas Friedrich, a Berlin journalist who kept a clandestine diary throughout the war, described the domestic propaganda environment in her 1945 memoir, Berlin Underground. The radio was always on. In homes, in shops, in factories, the voice never stopped. Goebbels understood that silence allows thought. His broadcasts filled every moment, answered every question before it was asked, addressed every doubt before it formed. Most Germans never consciously decided to believe the propaganda. They simply absorbed it through constant exposure until distinguishing between broadcast reality and actual reality became impossible. Those of us who listened to foreign broadcasts risked our lives, not just because of legal consequences, but because rejecting the radio reality meant living in isolation, knowing truths we couldn't share, seeing a different world than everyone around us. The technical sophistication of domestic control increased as the war continued. Goebbels introduced the Drahtfunk system, wired radio distribution through telephone lines to areas where radio reception was unreliable. This ensured every German could receive broadcasts, regardless of technical limitations. The system also prevented tuning to foreign stations, since the connection delivered only German programming. Dr. Otto Dietrich, Reich press chief, worked closely with Goebbels on coordinating newspaper and radio propaganda. His testimony at Nuremberg revealed the systematic nature of reality control. Every morning, we received instructions on what stories to emphasize, what language to use, what conclusions audiences should draw. Radio and newspapers reinforced identical messages simultaneously. A German citizen in 1943 would hear the same narrative on morning radio, read it in the newspaper, hear it again during factory loudspeaker broadcasts, encounter it in evening entertainment programs, and see it confirmed by neighbors who had absorbed the same messages. Dissenting became psychologically difficult. The propaganda created a shared reality so comprehensive that questioning it meant questioning everything everyone around you accepted as true. The effectiveness of this control manifested in Germans' continued resistance even as defeat became inevitable. In April 1945, with Soviet troops in Berlin, German radio broadcast messages of imminent victory through wonder weapons and relief armies. Many Germans believed these broadcasts until the moment of surrender. The reality in their ears was more powerful than the reality outside their windows. Great Britain, the enemy who listened. Goebbels directed substantial resources toward broadcasting to Great Britain, attempting to demoralize British civilians and undermine support for the war. The campaigns revealed both radio propaganda's power and its limits when targeting populations with access to alternative information. Lord Haw Haw, the mocking nickname for William Joyce, an American-Irish fascist broadcasting from Germany, became infamous in Britain for broadcasts that combined accurate military information with defeatist interpretation. Joyce's programs, aired from September 1939 through April 1945, reached millions of British listeners despite being technically illegal. The broadcasts were sophisticated. Joyce reported British naval losses before the British government announced them, using information from German intelligence. He described bombing damage to specific British cities in detail that seemed to confirm German reconnaissance. He interspersed factual information with demoralizing commentary about Britain's inevitable defeat, American unreliability, and the futility of resistance. British authorities initially dismissed Joyce as ineffective, but BBC surveys revealed that up to 60% of British adults had listened to his broadcasts by 1940. Many listeners claimed they tuned in for entertainment, mocking Joyce's accent and exaggerated claims. Yet the psychological impact was measurable. Morale reports from the Ministry of Information showed that Joyce's broadcasts increased anxiety about bombing, spread rumors about fifth columnists, and occasionally triggered panic when his predictions of attacks proved accurate. Violet Bonham Carter, British politician and broadcaster, confronted this threat by analysing Joyce's techniques in a 1941 BBC broadcast. Lord Haw-Haw succeeds not through obvious lies, but through the mixture of truth and distortion. He reports real events, confirmed by our own government, establishing credibility. Then he interprets those events to suggest futility and despair. A ship sunk becomes evidence of unstoppable U-boat superiority. A city bombed becomes proof that RAF cannot protect civilians. He never tells us to surrender. He simply makes continued resistance seem pointless. The propaganda works on those who are afraid, exhausted, or isolated. That is why we must counter, not just with facts, but with community and hope that makes the truth more appealing than his distortions. Goebbels expanded British targeted broadcasting by recruiting British traitors and prisoners of war to deliver messages in authentic accents. These broadcasters didn't promote Nazism explicitly. They expressed doubts about Churchill's leadership, questioned American commitment, emphasized class divisions, and suggested that the British working class was dying for capitalist interests. The messages exploited genuine anxieties to create psychological wedges that might fracture British unity. The campaign ultimately failed to break British morale, but not without impact. Post-war studies showed that German radio broadcasts contributed to war weariness, increased skepticism toward government statements, and spread defeatism that required constant counter-propaganda efforts. Britain survived because it maintained competing information sources and social structures that provided alternative realities stronger than Goebbels could create through radio alone. The Soviet Union, propaganda. Warfare on the Eastern Front, German broadcasts targeting the Soviet Union attempted to exploit ethnic divisions, Communist Party brutality, and Stalin's murderous purges to turn Soviet populations against their government. The campaign represented Goebbels' most ambitious attempt at psychological conquest and his most complete failure. Beginning in June 1941, German radio broadcasts in Russian, Ukrainian, and other Soviet languages painted Wehrmacht advance as liberation from communist tyranny. Programs featured Soviet defectors denouncing Stalin, descriptions of German soldiers as civilized protectors, and promises of national independence for non-Russian populations. The broadcasts contained substantial truth. Stalin had murdered millions through forced collectivization and political purges. Soviet populations, especially in Ukraine and the Baltic states, initially viewed Germans as potential liberators. German propaganda exploited this sentiment systematically. However, Nazi racial ideology and Wehrmacht brutality destroyed the propaganda narrative faster than Goebbels could construct it. Soviet citizens tuning to German broadcasts heard promises of liberation. Soviet citizens encountering actual German occupation experienced mass murder, enslavement, and systematic destruction. The gap between broadcast reality and experienced reality became too large for propaganda to bridge. Ilya Ehrenberg, Soviet journalist and propagandist, understood why German broadcasts failed. His 1942 article in Red Star explained, Goebbels' radio tells Ukrainians that Germans come as friends. German soldiers rape Ukrainian women and burn Ukrainian villages. Goebbels' radio promises freedom. German occupation brings slavery and death. Even those who hated Stalin recognize that Germans offer something worse. The lies are too large. Reality contradicts propaganda too obviously. German broadcasts might work on populations who don't directly experience German rule. They cannot work on populations who see daily that every German promise is a lie. The failure of propaganda in the Soviet Union revealed a critical limitation. Radio could manufacture reality only when audiences lacked direct experience contradicting the narrative. British civilians hadn't experienced German occupation, so Joyce's broadcasts could exploit fears and uncertainties. Soviet civilians under German occupation couldn't be convinced that the troops murdering their families were liberators. The propaganda failed because reality was too powerful to override. Goebbels recognized this failure and shifted strategy. By 1943, German broadcasts to the Soviet Union abandoned promises of liberation and focused instead on apocalyptic warnings of what would happen if the Red Army reached Germany. These broadcasts targeted German soldiers and German civilians, attempting to stiffen resistance by making surrender seem worse than death. The turn toward total mobilization. As German military fortunes declined, Goebbels transformed radio from a tool of conquest into a tool of fanatical resistance. The February 18, 1943 Sportpalast speech, broadcast live on German radio, marked this transition. Following the Stalingrad disaster, Goebbels delivered a 2-hour speech demanding total mobilization for total war. The broadcast was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Goebbels acknowledged setbacks, expressed shared suffering with ordinary Germans, then channeled fear and grief into renewed determination. He posed questions to the audience, receiving thunderous affirmations carefully orchestrated, but genuinely felt. "Do you want total war?" Goebbels asked. "Yes," the crowd roared. "Do you want a war more total and radical than anything we can imagine today?" "Yes." Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, was present at the Sportpalast and later described the broadcast's impact in his memoir, Inside the Third Reich. Goebbels had the crowd in ecstasy. More significantly, the radio broadcast reached millions who heard both the speech and the crowd's response. Germans listening at home were swept into the emotional experience, feeling part of the collective commitment. The speech was propaganda genius. It acknowledged reality, validated German suffering, then transformed despair into defiant resolve. In the weeks following, war production increased, volunteer rates surged, and civilian morale stabilized despite catastrophic military losses. Goebbels had used radio to convert defeat into determination. The broadcast revealed a dark truth about propaganda. Given skillful delivery and receptive audience, even obvious manipulation could prove effective. Germans hearing Goebbels knew they were being propagandized. They didn't care. The propaganda gave them psychological tools to process trauma, maintain hope, and find meaning in continued sacrifice. Truth became irrelevant. Only emotional sustenance mattered. As Allied bombing intensified, German radio adapted to provide psychological support for populations experiencing nightly terror. Broadcasts after air raids emphasized German resilience, exaggerated damage to enemy forces, and promised revenge through wonder weapons. The messages couldn't prevent physical destruction, but they prevented psychological collapse. Matthias Uhl, historian studying German home front morale, analyzed Gestapo reports from 1944-1945 and concluded, radio propaganda remained effective even as Germans recognized it as lies. People needed something to believe in, some narrative that made suffering bearable. Goebbels provided that narrative. His broadcasts offered hope when reality offered only despair, victory when defeat was obvious, meaning when everything seemed meaningless. The propaganda worked not because Germans believed the specific claims, but because they desperately needed to believe something. Goebbels understood that psychological survival sometimes requires voluntary self-deception. He exploited that need with ruthless skill. The final broadcasts, holding reality at bay. The last German radio broadcast came on May 1, 1945, announcing Hitler's death and Dönitz's succession. Even in defeat, the broadcast maintained the propaganda tone that had characterized 7 years of Nazi radio. Hitler had died fighting to his last breath against Bolshevism, not by suicide in a bunker. Germany would continue fighting to save European civilization from communism. The war could still be won. Germans listening to this final broadcast faced a choice between the reality in their ears and the reality outside their windows. Many chose the radio reality, continuing resistance for days after Hitler's death because the broadcasts told them victory remained possible. Dr. Werner Naumann, Goebbels' deputy who survived the war, provided testimony about the final days of German radio in 1947 interrogation. Goebbels knew the war was lost by autumn 1944. His broadcasts didn't aim to achieve victory. They aimed to prevent surrender for as long as possible. Every day Germans continued fighting was a success. The broadcasts maintained psychological resistance by denying reality, offering false hope, and making acceptance of defeat seem like betrayal of those who had already died. The strategy worked. Germans fought street by street in Berlin for a government that no longer existed because radio broadcasts told them fighting mattered. Goebbels controlled German consciousness until the transmitters went silent. Even in death, he achieved his purpose. The propaganda outlasted the Reich. The enduring warning, post-war analysis of Nazi radio propaganda revealed techniques that would be studied, refined, and re-employed by authoritarian regimes worldwide. The basic insights proved universally applicable. Create media saturation that prevents alternative viewpoints. Mix truth with lies to establish credibility. Appeal to emotion rather than reason. Provide simple narratives for complex situations. Make propaganda invisible by integrating it into entertainment. Control the information environment so completely that citizens cannot distinguish between genuine reality and manufactured reality. Allied interrogators questioned Goebbels' staff extensively about techniques and effectiveness. Hans Fritzsche, the radio division chief put on trial at Nuremberg, provided the most comprehensive assessment. We discovered that modern communications technology makes possible a new form of tyranny. Previous dictatorships controlled people through physical force. We controlled them through information control. A German in 1943 lived in a world where every source of information reinforced Nazi narratives. Radio, newspapers, newsreels, loudspeakers, all told the same story. Doubting required rejecting everything you heard from every source you had access to. Most people cannot maintain such skepticism. They accept consensus reality even when it contradicts physical evidence. We created consensus reality through media saturation. The technique worked devastatingly well. Fritzsche was acquitted at Nuremberg, the tribunal ruling that while his broadcasts were propaganda, they didn't constitute crimes against peace or humanity. The verdict ignored that propaganda had enabled those crimes by manufacturing public consent for aggressive war and genocide. Without Goebbels' radio weapon preparing psychological terrain, Nazi atrocities would have faced resistance that might have prevented or limited their scope. The true casualty count from Nazi radio propaganda cannot be calculated. How many Austrians welcomed Anschluss because broadcasts convinced them unification was destiny? How many Czechs accepted Munich because German radio created the Sudeten crisis? How many Germans accepted genocide because radio broadcasts dehumanized Jews for years before the killing began? How many Allied soldiers died because German civilians, sustained by radio propaganda, continued hopeless resistance into 1945? The legacy extends beyond World War II. Soviet broadcasts during the Cold War employed Goebbels' techniques. Chinese communist propaganda copied his methods of media saturation and reality replacement. Modern authoritarian regimes from North Korea to contemporary examples use state media to create alternative realities that sustain unpopular governments and justify atrocities. British historian Ian Kershaw, analyzing Nazi propaganda effectiveness in his comprehensive Hitler biography, concluded, Goebbels proved that in modern societies, Controlling information means controlling reality. He didn't invent propaganda, but he industrialized it, weaponized it, and demonstrated its power to enable crimes that would have been impossible without mass psychological manipulation. The radio broadcasts didn't simply report Nazi ideology. They created a mental environment where that ideology seemed rational, normal, inevitable. This was not persuasion. It was psychological occupation. The broadcasts conquered minds before armies conquered territory. Stefan Starzyński, the Polish journalist who recognized radio's power in September 1939, did not survive to see Germany's defeat. He was executed by the Gestapo in December 1939 for organizing Polish resistance. But his final report, smuggled to London before his death, contained a warning that remains urgent. The Germans have discovered that modern technology allows the creation of false realities more powerful than truth. Radio reaches into homes, bypasses rational defenses, shapes consciousness through repetition and emotional manipulation. Future tyrants will study what Goebbels achieved and improve upon it. The danger is not propaganda we recognize as propaganda. The danger is the construction of alternative realities so comprehensive that populations lose the ability to distinguish truth from manufactured narrative. Defending against this requires not just access to truthful information, but psychological resistance to manipulation itself. This may be the defining challenge of the modern age. On May 1st, 1945, Joseph Goebbels poisoned his 6 children, then shot himself in the Reich Chancellery garden as Soviet troops approached. His final act was ensuring his family didn't survive to see the reality his broadcasts had denied. The transmitters fell silent. The alternative reality he had constructed through 7 years of broadcasts collapsed instantly. Germans emerging from bunkers discovered that the imminent wonder weapons didn't exist, the relief armies weren't coming, and the promised victory had always been fiction. Yet Goebbels had succeeded in his fundamental purpose. He had used radio to sustain Nazi power far longer than military reality justified. He had enabled crimes that required mass psychological compliance. He had demonstrated that technology could make tyranny absolute by controlling not just bodies, but consciousness itself. The equipment he used was primitive by modern standards. The Deutschlandsender that reached millions with Nazi propaganda was a fraction as powerful as contemporary broadcast networks. He had no internet, no social media, no algorithmic targeting of individual psychologies. He conquered minds with simple radio waves and sophisticated understanding of mass psychology. That understanding didn't die with him. The techniques he pioneered live on wherever authoritarian powers control media, wherever propagandists mix truth with lies to establish credibility, wherever governments create false realities to justify atrocities, wherever populations lose the ability to distinguish manufactured narratives from genuine truth. Radio was supposed to be a tool for enlightenment, education, and cultural exchange. Goebbels proved it could be a weapon as devastating as any bomber, as effective as any army, conquering territory measured not in kilometers, but in human consciousness, replacing reality itself with manufactured illusions that sustained evil until physical force ended what psychological manipulation had enabled. The transmitters are long silent. The broadcasts cannot be unheard. The techniques cannot be unlearned, and the warning cannot be ignored. In every era where technology enables information control, Goebbels' ghost whispers that power flows not from controlling behavior, but from controlling reality itself, one broadcast at a time, until millions believe lies more readily than they believe their own eyes. That is the lesson of Nazi radio propaganda. Not that propaganda is powerful. That was always known. That modern communications technology makes possible the complete replacement of reality with fiction, and that populations subjected to such systematic manipulation can lose the ability to resist, even when the lies become obvious. The war was won in 1945. The battle against what Goebbels created continues wherever truth struggles against manufactured narrative for control of human consciousness. His weapon was not military. It was psychological, and it was devastatingly effective at transforming radio waves into instruments of conquest, submission, and mass delusion that enabled atrocities requiring millions to believe the unbelievable, accept the unacceptable, and commit the unforgivable. The static is silent now. But the techniques echo on, refined and amplified by technologies Goebbels never imagined, proving that his most enduring victory was not the territory his broadcasts helped conquer, but the demonstrations that conquering minds makes conquering territory inevitable, and that the greatest weapon is not the one that destroys bodies, but the one that captures consciousness and makes populations willing participants in their own subjugation.